Virginia, 1861. The girl was told letters were poison, that knowing them would make her restless, dangerous. So she never touched a book, never traced a word. Yet by 12, she knew more than anyone on the plantation. Because when white folks thought a black child was invisible, they spoke freely. She stood quiet in corners, shelling peas, pouring water, tying ribbons, listening. She learned which names were whispered, which debts were hidden, which loyalties were false. She could not read a single letter on paper, but she remembered every word spoken aloud. And in a year, when Virginia was tearing itself apart, memory became the most dangerous thing a child could carry. The prohibition did not come with a whip or a shout. That was what made it settle so deeply. It came on a quiet afternoon in Virginia, 1861, when the house was heavy with summer heat and the distant sound of cicadas. The girl, no more than 9, stood near the doorway of the small parlor, pretending to dust a table that had already been cleaned twice. Across the room, the mistress sat with her niece, a pale young woman recently arrived from Richmond, a thin book resting open on her lap. The girl had learned the habit of stillness early. Stillness kept her unnoticed. Stillness kept her safe, but her eyes betrayed her. They lingered too long on the page, not on the words. She did not know them, but on the shapes, the neat black lines, the way the woman's finger moved left to right, like a measured walk. "Say it again," the niece said softly, smiling as she read aloud. The girl did not understand the sentence, but she remembered its sound. She always did. That was when the mistress looked up. At first, nothing was said. The mistress only watched. Her gaze followed the child's eyes, then returned to the open book. A thin line formed where her lips met. The room seemed to tighten, as if even the air had learned to wait. "You," the mistress said at last, not sharply, calmly. "Come here." The girl obeyed. She always obeyed. The mistress closed the book with one deliberate motion and rested her hand upon it, as though protecting something fragile. She looked down at the child, not with rage, but with calculation. "You been watching," she said. The girl lowered her eyes. "Yes'm." "Watching what?" The girl hesitated. The wrong answer could stretch into hours of consequence. "The lady reddened," she said finally. The mistress exhaled through her nose, a sound halfway between a sigh and a warning. She motioned for the niece to leave the room. When the door closed, the silence became heavier than before. "You listen careful," the mistress said, leaning forward. "Letters ain't meant for you." The girl said nothing. "They make heads restless," the mistress continued. "Make servants forget their place. You don't need that kind of trouble." The words were spoken gently, almost kindly. That kindness was what made them final. From that day forward, the rules changed. The girl was no longer allowed near the parlor when books were present. She was sent out whenever newspapers arrived, if scraps of paper appeared. Wrapping, notes, old bills, she was told to turn away. The prohibition was never shouted across the yard. It was enforced through routine, through glances, through the quiet understanding that disobedience would not be forgiven twice. What hurt most was not the denial itself, but the explanation. "You don't need letters," the mistress said once, when the girl dared to ask why. "Your kind learn with hands, not heads." The girl nodded, because nodding was expected. But something settled inside her then. Something heavy, something sharp. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that ignorance was not an accident. It was a condition imposed. Yet the prohibition did something unexpected. It sharpened her listening. If she could not see words, she would hear them. If she could not touch paper, she would touch memory instead. She began to notice how people spoke differently when they believed no one important was present. How men loosened their voices after supper. how women whispered secrets to the air while brushing hair or fastening buttons. The mistress herself spoke freely in the girl's presence, assuming that a child barred from letters was barred from understanding. Plans were discussed, names mentioned, figures spoken aloud, then forgotten. The girl learned that letters were not the only vessels of knowledge. She learned the sound of fear disguised as pride, the tone of lies told softly, the weight of truth when spoken carelessly. She remembered conversations the way others remembered hymns, exact, word for word, preserved through repetition in her mind, and the prohibition followed her everywhere. In the kitchen, when another child traced shapes in flour, the girl was pulled away. In the yard, when an older boy tried to teach her the sound of a letter, using a stick in dirt, he was punished, and she was warned without words that curiosity was contagious. Still, the world spoke around her. In 1861, Virginia was restless. Men argued about secession. Soldiers passed through roads nearby. Letters arrived sealed with urgency, read aloud behind closed doors. The girl never saw those pages, but she heard every sentence spoken after. The prohibition was meant to empty her mind. Instead, it taught her restraint. It taught her that knowledge, when denied, becomes dangerous. That silence could be a shelter. That remembering was a form of resistance invisible to those who believed power lived only in ink and paper. By forbidding her letters, they believed they had closed a door. They did not notice that they had opened another, one that required no book at all. Silence was not taught to her. It was learned. After the prohibition, the girl began to understand that words were watched. But quiet was overlooked. In Virginia, 1861, the plantation moved according to habits older than memory. Bells rang. Orders were given. Voices rose and fell like weather. And beneath it all, silence moved freely, unnoticed, unchallenged. At first, her quiet was mistaken for obedience. The mistress approved of it. "That one listens," she said once, as if speaking of a well-trained animal. The overseer barely noticed her at all. Silence made her useful. Silence made her safe. So the girl leaned into it. She learned when to lower her eyes. Not quickly, which drew attention, but slowly, as if respect lived in her bones. She learned how to stand close enough to be useful, yet distant enough to be ignored. When spoken to, she answered plainly. No extra words. No questions. Her voice became something people heard without remembering. And in forgetting her, they revealed themselves. Silence earned her positions other children did not receive. She was asked to stand near doors, waiting in case someone needed water. She was kept in rooms longer than necessary because no one thought to send her away. Her presence faded into the walls. In the mornings, she brushed dust from mantels while men discussed crop failures and unpaid notes. They spoke in half sentences, assuming meaning could not travel far. In the evenings, she stitched hems beside women who whispered names that were not meant for daylight. Names of sons, of debts, of shame. The girl did not react. She did not flinch when voices sharpened. She did not pause when secrets passed over her head. She understood something vital. Reaction invited removal. Another child once gasped when hearing a forbidden name. That child was sent away from the house and did not return. The lesson was clear and did not need repeating, so the girl became stiller. Silence, she learned, was not emptiness. It was a vessel. She held words the way others held breath. Carefully, fully, without letting any escape. At night, lying on a thin pallet, she replayed conversations in her mind. Not the meaning. She was young, and much of it lay beyond her understanding. But the sound, the order of names, the numbers spoken without caution, the way one voice lowered when another entered the room. She memorized patterns. Who spoke freely? Who checked the door first? Who whispered only after dark? In the house, silence became her currency. Because she did not speak, People spoke around her. Because she never repeated what she heard, she was trusted without being trusted. One afternoon, while shelling peas near the back door, she heard the mistress speak sharply to a visitor. The visitor's name was spoken twice. The reason for his visit was hinted at, but not said aloud. That evening, the overseer cursed under his breath about the same name. The girl did not understand the connection, but she remembered it. Weeks later, that name returned. This time spoken in fear. Silence allowed her to collect such moments like stones in a pocket. Individually small, together heavy. She also learned when silence was required to protect herself. There were questions she did not answer, even when asked directly. If asked what she had seen, she replied with what was safe, not what was true. Silence did not always mean saying nothing. Sometimes it meant choosing which truths to leave untouched. Once, a woman pressed her. "You hear things, don't you?" The woman said, smiling too tightly. The girl lowered her eyes. "I just work, ma'am." The woman studied her for a moment, then laughed softly and turned away. Silence had passed its test. In a year when Virginia's roads filled with soldiers and rumors, silence grew more valuable than ever. Men spoke of allegiance as if it were a coat that could be removed and replaced. Words like Union and Confederate floated through rooms without explanation, heavy with consequence. The girl did not ask what they meant. She stored them. She noticed how voices changed when uniforms appeared at the gate, how hospitality grew stiff, how names were chosen carefully, or not at all. Silence taught her that what was not said often mattered more than what was. The other enslaved children did not understand her restraint. They whispered among themselves, wondered why she did not speak more, why she never laughed loudly or complained. But the girl had learned something they had not yet learned. Silence kept doors open. It kept her in rooms where knowledge passed freely. It kept her from punishment that fell on those who spoke too soon or too much. It made her presence tolerable to those who believed quiet minds were harmless minds. And in that mistaken belief, power rested. Silence gave her time to grow, time to understand which words could wound and which could protect, time to decide, one day, whether memory would remain hidden or be used. She was still a child, still enslaved, still forbidden from letters. But silence had given her something rare in that world: access. And once a child learns how to remain unseen while standing in plain sight, the world begins to speak differently around her. The decision was not announced. It never was. In Virginia, late summer of 1861, the girl simply stopped being sent to the fields. One morning, instead of following the others down the dusty path, she was told to remain near the house. No explanation was given. No ceremony marked the change. It was treated as though it had always been so. "Stay close today," the mistress said, already turning away. "There will be company." Company meant voices. Voices meant information. The girl understood at once that this was not a reward, it was a judgment. Silence had made her acceptable. Obedience had made her useful, and usefulness in that world was the closest thing to protection. Inside the house, time moved differently. The air was cooler. Floors were smooth beneath bare feet. Sounds carried in ways they did not outside. A cough in the parlor could be heard in the hall. A whispered argument traveled through doorframes like smoke. Her new duties were small but constant. Fetch water. Hold a door. Carry linens from one room to another. Tasks that required her presence without demanding her voice. She was instructed where to stand, where not to look, how long to wait. The rules were clear even when unspoken. Do not linger too close. Do not step too far away. Do not interrupt. And above all, do not appear curious. At first, she moved carefully, aware that one misstep could send her back to the fields. She learned the shape of the house by memory. The narrow place near the stair, where voices echoed most clearly, the window seat where women forgot themselves, the sideboard where men leaned during long discussions. House placement was not merely about location. It was about exposure. In the fields, words were shouted. Orders, complaints, prayers. In the house, words were chosen. Lowered. Here. People spoke of things they did not wish to travel far. The girl learned quickly that the house had moods. Mornings were brisk, full of instruction. Afternoons stretched and softened, tongues loosening with heat. Evenings carried the most truth. Lamps dimmed. Guards lowered. Voices dropped into confession without meaning to. She stood nearby while the mistress discussed shortages with neighbors. She carried trays while men spoke of loans and land titles. Names were spoken in tones that revealed more than the words themselves. Resentment, fear, ambition. No one told her to forget what she heard. They assumed she already had. House placement also changed how others saw her. The field hands noticed her absence. Some watched with envy. Others with caution. A few whispered that she must have done something wrong to be pulled inside. The girl did not answer. She knew better than to explain. Inside the house, she became part of the background. A chair that could move. A shadow that fetched things. And shadows hear everything. One afternoon, a man arrived unexpectedly. His boots were dusty, his voice tense. He spoke urgently to the master in the study. The girl waited in the hallway, holding a pitcher she had already poured from. The door was not fully closed. She heard words like patrols, papers, questions being asked. She did not understand all of it, but she understood the fear beneath it. She memorized the names mentioned, the places referenced, the pause that followed certain sentences. Later that week, the same names were spoken again, this time with anger. The girl noticed the connection. House placement had given her not just access, but context. The house also taught her hierarchy, in ways the fields never could. She learned who deferred to whom. Which women commanded quietly. Which men pretended authority they did not possess. She saw how voices softened in the presence of certain guests, how posture changed when particular names were mentioned. This knowledge did not come from reading. It came from watching. House placement sharpened her understanding of power. She learned that power did not always shout. Often, it whispered. Often, it waited until servants were present, trusting that those servants were harmless. One evening, while folding linens in a corner of the parlor, she heard the mistress speak of her. "That one's steady," the mistress said. "Doesn't talk, doesn't look about." The words were meant as praise. The girl felt nothing. Praise was as dangerous as blame. Still, the placement continued. She was allowed near guests she had never seen before. Some wore uniforms. Some spoke with accents from distant places. Their conversations were careful at first, then careless as the hours passed. War had not yet arrived at the doorstep, but it had entered the house through words, through plans spoken aloud, through assumptions that no one listening could make sense of them. The girl made sense of more than they imagined. She learned that house placement was temporary, conditional. It could be revoked at any moment. One wrong word, one remembered look, one sign of curiosity. So she refined her stillness. She became quieter inside than she had ever been outside. Her face revealed nothing. Her movements were precise. Her presence was forgettable. But her memory grew crowded. House placement did not give her freedom. It gave her proximity. And proximity, when combined with silence and memory, was dangerous. By placing her in the house, they believed they had placed her under control. They did not realize they had placed her at the center of everything they wished to hide. The ledger went missing on a Tuesday. It was not the sort of thing that caused alarm at first. Ledgers were always being moved, carried from desk to drawer, from office to shelf. But by midday in Virginia, 1861, the house had shifted. Voices sharpened. Footsteps quickened. Doors closed more firmly than usual. The girl noticed at once. She was in the hallway outside the study, holding a folded cloth, when the overseer's voice rose in frustration. He was not shouting. That would have drawn too much attention. But his tone carried a strain she had not heard before. "It was here yesterday," he said. "I read from it myself." The master responded quietly. Too quietly. "Lower your voice." The ledger was mentioned again, this time with numbers. Figures spoken aloud, then repeated, as though saying them twice might summon the missing book back into place. The girl stood still. She had heard those numbers before. Weeks earlier. She had been present when the overseer read aloud from the same ledger, complaining about shortages while pacing the room. She had not understood their meaning then, but she had remembered the sound of them. The way he hesitated before certain figures. The way he cleared his throat after reading a particular name. Now those same figures returned, heavy with consequence. The ledger, she soon understood, was more than a book. It held accounts, names, debts, records that tied land, labor, and money together. It was proof. And proof in uncertain times was dangerous to lose. By afternoon, the house was restless. Servants were questioned carefully, politely, as though politeness might coax truth where force could not yet be used. "Have you seen it? Did anyone enter the study? Were you here yesterday evening?" The girl was asked last. She lowered her eyes. "No, sir." It was true. She had not seen the ledger itself, only heard it. That distinction mattered. The overseer studied her face longer than was comfortable. He was looking for something. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. He found neither. Silence had trained her well. "Go on," he said finally. That night, the house did not settle as it usually did. Lamps stayed lit later. Whispers traveled the halls. The girl lay awake, listening to fragments of conversation carried through walls. "They'll ask questions if it turns up gone. He should never have written it down. Certain names ought not be together on a page." The girl pieced together what she could. The ledger held more than numbers. It held connections. Between people who preferred not to be connected. Between promises spoken aloud and promises denied later. The next morning, tension tightened further. The overseer returned to the study, his patience thin. He read from memory now, reciting figures aloud in hopes of reconstructing what was lost. His voice shook. Not with fear, but with urgency. 14 head accounted for. 3 missing. Payment due by harvest. The girl stood near the doorway, pretending to adjust a curtain. She remembered it differently. She remembered 15. She remembered 2 missing. She remembered the name spoken after, a name the overseer had paused on. Memory stirred within her, sharp and clear. For the first time, she felt the weight of what she carried. She said nothing. The ledger was found 2 days later, tucked behind a stack of old correspondence in a cabinet no one had checked. Relief moved through the house like a sigh. Voices softened. Accusations dissolved before they could take form. But the relief did not last. When the ledger was reviewed, discrepancies appeared. Numbers did not align with what had been spoken earlier. Names appeared out of order. Figures did not match what the overseer insisted he remembered. "It's been altered," he said, his voice tight. The master frowned. "Or you misremember." Silence followed. The girl stood nearby, holding a tray she did not need to carry. She listened as the men argued, not loudly, but fiercely. Each insisted on his version of truth. Each trusted his memory. None questioned hers. That was the danger. She realized then that memory, when unchallenged, could outweigh ink. That what she carried in her mind was not only knowledge. It was leverage. The ledger incident taught her restraint. She could have spoken. She could have corrected them. But she understood the cost. To reveal accuracy would invite scrutiny. To demonstrate knowledge would provoke suspicion, so she remained quiet. Later, the overseer was reprimanded, not severely, but enough to wound his pride. Trust shifted. Power tilted slightly. The girl observed it all unseen. From that day on, she listened differently. Not just to words, but to who trusted memory and who relied on paper. She noticed which men repeated things aloud, as if to reassure themselves. Which women corrected others gently, shaping truth through tone rather than fact. She learned that records were fragile. That paper could be misplaced, altered, destroyed. But spoken words, once remembered, lived on untouched. The ledger incident marked a change within her. Before, she listened because silence required it. Now, she listened because she understood its value. She began to organize what she heard, not by meaning alone, but by consequence. Which details could harm, which could protect, which must never be spoken. The house returned to its routines. The ledger was locked away more carefully. Conversations grew more guarded. But the damage had already been done. The girl had learned that adults were not as certain as they pretended. That authority rested on fragile foundations. That memory, hers, could unsettle the careful balance of power without ever making a sound. The ledger went back onto its shelf. But the knowledge it contained lived on. Inside a child who could not read a single letter, yet remembered every word spoken aloud, and that made her dangerous in ways no one yet understood. War did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces. In Virginia, autumn of 1861, the first sign was not gunfire, but hesitation. Men paused before speaking. Women lowered their voices mid-sentence. Letters arrived more often, and were burned more quickly. The girl noticed these things long before anyone said the word war aloud in her presence. She had been placed in the house long enough now to recognize unease when it entered a room. Conversations changed shape. Where once voices filled space, now they clung to corners. Words were chosen carefully, then weighed again before being spoken. Even laughter sounded uncertain, as though it might be remembered later and used as proof of something unwise. Soldiers passed the road more frequently, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not. They drank water from the well and asked polite questions that were not truly questions at all. Who lives here? Who owns this land? Who comes and goes? The girl carried water to them, her eyes lowered, her expression empty. They barely looked at her. They never considered what she might hear. Inside the house, war entered through argument. Men spoke of allegiance as though it were a matter of convenience. One afternoon, the master insisted that loyalty had always been clear. That night, the same loyalty was discussed again. This time in doubt. Names were spoken, then dismissed. Others were spoken and followed by silence. The girl listened. She learned that war made liars of many. Men who spoke bravely in daylight whispered fear after dark. Women who once discussed dresses now spoke of sons and borders and supplies. The language of the house grew harder, sharper. Words like patrol, search, questioning entered daily speech. She noticed how quickly kindness thinned when fear took hold. A servant was questioned one evening for being late. The tone was not cruel, but it was final. Another was warned not to wander after dusk. The rules of movement tightened quietly, without announcement. The girl understood this tightening instinctively. War, she learned, did not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrived as restriction. The first uniforms appeared at the gate near dusk. Not many, just enough to unsettle. The men were polite, respectful. They were invited inside. Food was served. Conversation flowed carefully, each side revealing little. The girl stood near the wall, holding a tray she was not asked to refill. The men spoke of nearby counties, of roads watched, of people questioned and released, or not. Names were mentioned without explanation. The girl stored them. One uniformed man laughed and said, These children don't understand any of this." The girl did not move. After they left, the house exhaled. Doors were shut. Voices dropped further. The mistress said quietly, "This is only the beginning." That night, the girl could not sleep. She heard movement outside, boots on gravel, the low murmur of voices, the distant sound of a horse. Nothing came of it. That, too, was part of the waiting. In the days that followed, the house prepared without admitting it was preparing. Supplies were counted. Certain papers were hidden. Conversations took place behind closed doors, then resumed casually in public rooms. The girl remained present. War sharpened her value and her danger at the same time. She was moved more frequently now, sent to fetch, to carry, to wait. Her presence was useful because she did not ask questions, because she did not react. But she noticed that eyes lingered on her longer than before. Once, the overseer stopped speaking mid-sentence when he realized she was standing near the door. He dismissed her abruptly. The girl bowed her head and left without protest. It was the first time anyone had considered her presence a risk. The war drew closer not through battle, but through fear of exposure. People feared being overheard, feared being remembered. The girl understood this fear better than they knew. One evening, she overheard a conversation she knew she should not have heard. Two men argued in low voices about documents that should be destroyed, about names that must not be linked, about what would happen if the wrong people came asking. The girl stood frozen in place, her heart steady, her face unchanged. She did not understand all of it, but she understood enough. War had turned words into evidence. The following week, patrols came closer to the house, not every day, just often enough. The mistress began sending the girl away more frequently during certain discussions. Not always, only when the danger felt immediate. The girl learned to measure fear by distance. When fear was distant, she remained. When fear was close, she was removed. She watched the other servants grow anxious. Some whispered of escape. Others whispered of loyalty. The girl did neither. She listened. War, she learned, was not only fought with weapons. It was fought with memory, with testimony, with what could be recalled when asked. And she carried more of that than anyone. One afternoon, a man arrived unannounced. He spoke briefly to the master, then asked questions of several servants. The girl was not questioned. That absence unsettled her more than interrogation would have. She realized then that survival would require greater restraint than ever before. That knowing too much could be as dangerous as knowing nothing. War had made the house brittle. One wrong word could shatter it. The girl adjusted herself accordingly. She narrowed her listening. She became selective. She began to forget deliberately, not truly forget, but bury certain details deeper than others. She learned that memory, like silence, must be controlled. War did not free her, but it clarified her position. She was no longer just a quiet child in the corner. She was a witness in a world that suddenly understood the cost of witnesses. And as the sound of distant conflict crept closer, the girl remained where she had always been, still unnoticed, carrying truths that others feared would survive them. The confidence was not given freely. It slipped. By winter of 1861, the house had grown tired of fear, not less afraid, only wary of carrying it alone. That was when people began to speak in ways they had sworn they would not. Not loudly, not boldly, but privately. And privacy, the girl had learned, was where danger gathered. It began with the mistress's sister. The woman had arrived weeks earlier, her mourning clothes still new, her voice worn thin from grief she did not name aloud. She spent long hours in the small sitting room near the back of the house, asking for the girl to be nearby. Not because she needed help, but because silence made her feel less alone. "Sit there," the woman said one evening, gesturing toward a low stool near the hearth. You don't need to do anything. The girl sat. Firelight softened the room. Wind pressed against the windows. Outside, the world felt distant, held at bay by walls and lamplight. Inside, the woman began to speak. At first, it was harmless talk. Complaints about the cold. About Virginia changing too quickly. About people who no longer wrote as often as they once had. The girl listened, as she always did. Then the words grew heavier. I shouldn't tell you this, the woman said suddenly, staring into the fire. She laughed softly, without humor. But what harm could it do? The girl did not look up. The woman spoke of her husband, where he had gone, and why he could not return yet. She spoke of letters received and letters destroyed, of promises made under pressure, of names she feared hearing spoken by the wrong mouths. She spoke because she believed the girl could not understand. Illiteracy, in the woman's mind, meant innocence. The girl recognized the shift immediately. This was not careless talk. This was confession. She adjusted herself, lowering her breathing, stilling her hands. She did not nod. She did not react. She allowed the woman's words to fall as they wished. Night after night, the woman spoke. Each time, she began with restraint and ended with release. The girl became part of the furniture, present, useful, invisible. One evening, the woman said a name the girl had heard before. A name connected to the ledger. A name spoken earlier in fear. The girl stored it. Another night, the woman mentioned a place, quietly, as though the walls might listen. The girl remembered it, pairing it with other details she had gathered over months. Confidence, once given, grows. The woman began to rely on the girl's presence. She asked for her specifically, noticed when she was absent. You don't speak much, the woman said once, smiling faintly. That's a comfort. The girl said nothing. The danger lay not in what was spoken, but in what was assumed. The woman assumed that silence meant emptiness. That memory required letters. That a child forbidden from learning could not possibly arrange spoken truths into meaning. The girl understood now that confidence was more perilous than suspicion. Suspicion guarded words. Confidence spilled them. One night, the woman's voice broke. She covered her face and spoke of something she had never spoken of before. A choice made years earlier, consequences hidden carefully, records altered to protect reputations. The girl listened. She did not understand all of it, but she understood enough to recognize that these words, spoken aloud, could destroy more than one life if ever repeated. The next day, the woman acted as though nothing had been said. This, too, was a lesson. People trusted silence not because it was loyal, but because it was convenient. The girl began to fear her own position. She had learned to be quiet. She had learned to remember. But now she was being entrusted with truths meant never to surface. Truths that carried weight far beyond her years. She wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if someone suspected what she carried. The danger became clear one afternoon when the mistress entered the sitting room unexpectedly and found the woman speaking mid-sentence. The woman stopped. The room stilled. The girl stood slowly, ready to leave. No, the woman said quickly. She can stay. The mistress hesitated, then nodded. The girl felt it then, the shift. Her presence had been permitted where it should not have been. Trust, once misplaced, becomes liability. That night, the girl lay awake longer than usual. She replayed the woman's words, weighing them differently now. Not as information, but as risk. She realized she would have to manage what others gave her. Not all memory could be held equally. Some things must be buried deeper. Some must never be connected aloud, even in her own thoughts. Dangerous confidence had given her access, but it had also placed her closer to harm. From then on, she altered herself slightly. Not enough to be noticed, just enough to appear less present, more distant. less dependable as a silent listener. She answered more often when spoken to. She shifted positions in the room. She allowed herself to be sent away occasionally without resistance. She learned that trust must be discouraged. The woman noticed the change. "You've grown quiet," she said one evening, not realizing the truth of it. The girl lowered her eyes. "Yes'm." Confidence faded slowly. Confessions thinned. The woman returned to safer talk. The danger passed, for now. But the girl had learned a crucial truth. Knowledge gathered without request could be survived. Knowledge entrusted deliberately came with expectation. And expectation was a chain. By surviving the dangerous confidence, the girl learned not just how to listen, but how to limit what others were willing to give her. She was still silent, still observant, still forbidden from letters. But now, she understood that the most dangerous words were not those overheard by accident, but those spoken softly, willingly, to someone believed incapable of remembering. The first time memory protected her, it did so without ceremony. It was early 1862, the cold lingering longer than expected, when another child was blamed for something small. A missing spoon, a miscounted measure of grain. Accusations moved quickly in those days. Fear sharpened tempers. Patience wore thin. The girl was standing nearby when the questioning began. The child, a boy younger than she, could not explain himself. His words tumbled over one another. Each answer only seemed to make matters worse. The overseer's voice tightened, not loud, but firm in the way that left no space for protest. The girl listened. She remembered the spoon. She remembered hearing the mistress instruct a servant to move utensils earlier that morning. She remembered the number spoken aloud, the drawer mentioned, the offhand comment that followed. Memory rose within her, not as impulse, but as calculation. This was not the time for silence alone. She stepped forward just enough to be seen. "Beg pardon, sir," she said softly. The room paused. Not because her words carried authority, but because interruption from her was unexpected. "I heard the spoon moved," she continued, careful to keep her voice plain. "Mrs. said it was set aside." The overseer frowned. "You certain?" "Yes, sir." There was no emotion in her voice, no urgency, no appeal, just recollection. The overseer turned to the mistress, who hesitated, then nodded. "That's right. I did." The boy was released without comment. The matter ended as if it had never existed. The girl returned to her place. No one thanked her. No one punished her. But something had shifted. For the first time, memory had been spoken aloud, and it had worked. She learned quickly from that moment. Memory could be protection if used sparingly. Accuracy mattered. Tone mattered more. She did not repeat everything she knew. She chose moments when remembering would restore order, rather than disrupt it. She offered details that aligned with what those in power already believed, or were willing to believe. Memory, she understood now, must serve balance. In the weeks that followed, she used it again, but never often enough to draw notice. When a servant was accused of lingering where he should not have been, the girl remembered a task assigned elsewhere. When an argument arose over supplies, she recalled a conversation that clarified intent. Each time, she spoke as though memory were coincidence. "I heard it said earlier. I recall it that way. I may be mistaken, but..." She learned the language of uncertainty. Certainty invited challenge. Uncertainty allowed correction without threat. Memory protected not just others, but herself. Once, the overseer questioned her directly about a conversation she had overheard weeks earlier. His tone was casual, curious. "You hear many things," he said. "What do you make of them?" The girl lowered her eyes. "I don't make anything of them, sir. I just remember what's said when I'm near." It was true. And not. From then on, she learned to guard her memory more carefully, to decide not just when to speak, But how much? She began to think of memory as something layered. Some memories were safe, details anyone might recall. Others were dangerous, connections only she could see. Some were buried, never to be spoken. She practiced forgetting aloud. When asked about conversations she remembered clearly, she offered partial truths. She omitted names. She blurred sequences. She allowed others to believe their own versions were complete. Memory as protection required restraint. War made this skill essential. By now, the house lived under constant unease. Questions came from outside. Men visited with careful smiles and careful eyes. Everyone was conscious of what could be asked and what might be answered under pressure. The girl understood that if questioned harshly, she must appear to know little. Knowing too much could place her in danger. Knowing too little could make her suspicious. So she practiced balance. She remembered everything, but revealed only what restored calm. One evening, the mistress herself questioned her after a tense dinner. "You've been near us often?" The mistress said, "You hear things." The girl kept her posture respectful. "Yes'm." "And you remember?" "Yes'm." The mistress studied her face. "That's a burden, child." The girl said nothing. The mistress nodded slowly. "Remember this, then. Some things are better forgotten." The girl understood the warning beneath the advice. That night, she lay awake, replaying conversations not for their content, but for their risk. She sorted them as one might sort grain. What could be spoken? What must be hidden? What might protect another without endangering herself? Memory had become work, but it was also armor. When patrols came asking questions weeks later, the girl answered carefully. She remembered times and faces accurately, but not associations. She described movements, but not motives. Her memory was precise yet incomplete. It satisfied them. After they left, the house breathed again. No one realized how narrowly disaster had been avoided. Memory had shielded the household and the girl within it. But protection carried cost. She felt the weight of holding truths that could not be shared. The loneliness of knowing without being able to speak. The discipline required to remember without reacting. She was still a child. But memory had made her responsible. She understood now that survival did not come from forgetting, but from choosing how remembrance lived. Memory, she learned, was not merely a record of the past. It was a tool, a boundary, a defense. And in a world where letters were forbidden to her, memory had become her only means of protection. Quiet, invisible, and powerful enough to keep her alive. By the time spring returned to Virginia in 1862, the girl understood something that had taken others a lifetime to learn. Knowledge did not demand to be spoken. It waited. And waiting, when chosen deliberately, could be an act of survival. The house had changed again, not in ways easily named, but in the manner of things long under strain. Conversations ended sooner. Guests stayed shorter. Doors were closed that had once been left ajar. The girl remained present, but more carefully placed, as though her nearness were now considered rather than assumed. She felt the weight of what she carried more acutely than ever. There were moments, brief, sharp ones, when speaking would have been easy, when a name spoken aloud could have shifted blame, when a remembered phrase might have undone a lie, when a sequence of words, repeated faithfully, could have changed the direction of events unfolding around her. She did not speak, not because she was afraid, though fear was never far, but because she understood consequence. She had seen what happened when memory unsettled the order of things, how quickly trust thinned, how eyes narrowed, how silence, once comforting, became suspicious if broken too often. She knew that to reveal the full measure of her remembrance would be to invite attention she could not survive. One evening, a quiet argument took place in the study. The girl stood just outside the door, as she had so many times before, Two men spoke in low voices about a decision already made, and one not yet acted upon. The girl recognized the names. She understood the danger of the plan being discussed. She could have interrupted. She could have said a single sentence, truthful, precise, and the plan would have unraveled. Her hand tightened briefly at her side. Then she loosened it. She stepped back. The door remained closed. The words passed into memory alone. Later the consequences arrived, not immediately but surely. The plan failed in small ways, not catastrophically, just enough to wound pride and rearrange loyalties. The girl watched from a distance unseen. Silence had not prevented harm entirely, but it had prevented worse. The choice to remain silent was not passive. It required discipline. Each day, she weighed what she knew against what could be borne. She learned to sit with knowledge without letting it move her. She learned that restraint was not weakness, but control. Once, the mistress looked at her for a long moment and said, "You're older than you were." The girl lowered her eyes. Yes'm. She was still young, still enslaved, still denied letters. But silence had matured her in ways the house could not see. The war pressed closer. Not with battles at the gate, but with absences, men who did not return, letters that stopped coming, names no longer spoken. The girl held all of it, the beginnings and the endings. Without letting any of it escape her, she understood now that memory could be dangerous not only to others, but to herself. That speaking might bring a moment's justice and a lifetime of punishment. That surviving quietly could mean enduring longer than those who demanded to be heard. So she chose silence. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of intention. She became careful even in her thoughts, arranging them so they did not collide. Some memories she repeated to herself to keep them clear. Others she set aside, wrapped tightly, as one might wrap something fragile and never open it again. Time passed, children grew, seasons turned. The house endured. The girl remained. Those around her believed they had shaped her, kept her unlearned, unlettered, unthreatening. They mistook restraint for emptiness. They mistook silence for absence. They did not know that she had become a living record of their lives. She remembered how loyalties shifted before they were spoken aloud. She remembered which words were burned and which were buried. She remembered promises made quietly and broken without witnesses. She remembered who trusted whom and who pretended to, and she remembered without writing any of it down. In choosing silence, she chose to live, not to rise, not to escape, but to endure. She learned that survival was not always loud, that it did not always announce itself as courage. Sometimes, survival was simply the decision to carry the truth alone and let the world believe it had won. And so she stood, day after day, in rooms where history was spoken carelessly, holding it all inside her, every word, every pause, every lie, knowing that memory did not need paper to exist, and that silence, when chosen, could outlast power. In the end, nothing marked her choice. No moment of recognition. No acknowledgement. Only the steady continuation of breath, of work, of listening. And in that unmarked persistence, she remained, unwritten, unheard, and alive. Proof that even when a voice is denied, memory can survive in the dark, waiting intact for as long as silence allows.